Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today it is the 11th of August. Today we're looking at important developments and clarifications from the Kursk Oblast where we have the current Ukrainian offensive. Then we'll look at Luhansk, we'll look at Vodyane, and we'll have enough time to discuss the Russian unit structure and the quantity of the reinforcements coming in to defend against the Ukrainian attacks. We're going to work our way from the western axis to the southeastern one. So we're going to begin here in an area that is directed towards Korenovo. And what you're seeing is the involvement of the 103rd Territorial Defense Brigade, a unit that is mainly tasked with clearing out and solidifying control over rear villages. And then you have the 80th and 82nd Air Assault Brigades involved with the deeper spearheads. So something that I'm on the fence about is the marking of Snagost after all this time, because on the one hand, you have a lot of Russian sources very steadfast in the fact that they believe that the Ukrainians still control it in Abukhovka, along with some other villages nearby. And the issue is, I haven't seen any footage over the past 6 days to corroborate that. It's not unrealistic because you do have a confirmed Ukrainian presence nearby, a couple of kilometers eastwards in Lyubomovka. But still, you would assume that given all of the Russian footage coming out of shelling or landsits that we've seen very deep into the sort of front line, very deep into Kursk Oblast, that we would see at least something confirming the Ukrainian presence in the areas located on Korenovo's southern flank. But so far we have not. What we have received is actually testimony from residents that are located in some of these villages. For instance, this village here, Krasnuti Burskoy, and some other ones like Komarovka. And what they're saying is that there was a Ukrainian presence here confirmed in the initial offensive, so over the first 2 days, because that's when these residents were actually there and then they were evacuated. And 76,000 of them have actually been evacuated, a lot of them going into Kursk or even deeper into Russia. And what they're saying now is that they did see Ukrainian mobile crews, including within this village over here, where they saw at least 2 Bradleys roaming through and firing into various Russian positions in the area. And that would be enough to confirm that at least for a certain period of time there was a Ukrainian presence here. But we don't know what happened 4 days later. It could have changed because we do know that at a certain point in time you did have mobile units, these battalion tactical groups that the Ukrainians have formed that were at the outskirts southeastern of Korenovo, and they were eventually repelled. Same thing could have theoretically happened on the southern flank. So I'm really on the fence about this. But what's important for the Ukrainians now, and what's being reported by both sides, is that the Ukrainians are making a serious effort to shape the battlefield here in a way that would allow them to control all the key heights that are overlooking the city in an effort to actually take it over. Because on day one, that would be the golden opportunity to take over the city, the period in which it was not thought of as a city that was in danger, an area where you didn't have that many forces. You did have a certain presence of the new motor rifle regiment of the Air Force, and that's one of the units that was involved in defending and still is. Now they've been sort of abetted by the Ida detachment of the Ahmad forces, so that's one unit, and of course some of the nearby forces that sort of consolidated their sort of presence around the city, including the FSB, border patrols, all of them coming together here. And that was enough to repel the initial assaults. And now they've only gained more and more in terms of size, and also a lot of tank platoons, as we said before, coming in, mortars, artillery. And so now they're at a much stronger position than they were when they were initially surprised. And so the only way to actually dislodge the Russians would be through taking over some nearby geography. And so let's look at the elevation for a second. We have the ability to see where the Ukrainians are currently at and compare it to the topography. So here in X, you have this just massive, highly elevated hill that overlooks all of the sort of river valley on which these villages here that I'm marking with the semicircle are located. And that valley extends eastwards to this sort of forested area over here that I'm marking with the vertical X, and it's a Korenovo over here. And that would give the Ukrainians a prime position nearby, just completely open area where they would be able to look directly into the city. It would give them really good line of sight and opportunities to fire onto those forces. And that's something that the DRGs would take advantage of course, and also some of the sniper crews, ATGM crews, whatever it may be. And then DRGs would also be able to infiltrate into these forested areas located on the rear of the city. And so that's an issue that Russians will have to take into account when they try to solidify control of their flanks. And I'm not saying it will happen, but the Ukrainians definitely would be hoping that their attacks yield that sort of result. And then looking a bit northwards, this is where you have a more serious Ukrainian attempt that's been acknowledged very widely by Russian sources and also Ukrainian sources to a lesser extent. But there is a strong Ukrainian push now by the 80th and 82nd to cross over the highway, which they've done, get control over some of the forested fields, forested patches, which they've also done, and then occupy villages and take over the hills that are located just north of them. And so that's now what we're unsure about. We're unsure about the extent of the Ukrainian attacks here because we know that at the very least they've been able to advance. We could say, look, from Lyubimovka northwards, it's about 6-7 kilometers northwards in this general region, and they have been able to at least reach and be spotted in these forested areas. But we don't know if they're in control of Olgovka, Kremenoy, Zhuravli. These are some of the villages mentioned. Even more recently, Vitreno. And the idea of taking them over is that just north of these villages on the sort of eastern flank of Karanovo, you have this really large hill, this really important ridge that overlooks the city from the northeastern direction. And that ridge actually extends further eastwards into a lot of the villages that the Ukrainians tried infiltrating in the first place and were then repelled away from. And so you can see that sort of on the screen manifesting. And so, yeah, definitely the Ukrainians have an incentive to take over these positions. It will give them a way to not only envelop the village, which itself is certainly in a very large predicament in terms of elevation, if that were to be the case, but also then they'd have a really good line of sight to fire towards the one remaining supply line, because there's only one supply line when you think of it that is directly feeding into the city. I guess you also have the rail line and open fields, but you only have one paved road really connecting it to Rilsk to the northwest. And then located directly to the west, you have this really deep forested area, so it's not a solid position, and then also the river. And so in terms of the geography, it is difficult, but just because the Russians received an influx of manpower, it's going to be much more difficult for the Ukrainians to push forward here. And that's why they're now shifting their focus away from some of these deep raids and DRG infiltrations directly northwards towards an area like Logov that's really out of the Overton window. And they're shifting focus towards capturing some of the key cities in this area that will make a broader, or maybe not even broader, but more so an offensive that would actually have some sort of longevity. Because without capturing major cities and nodes, then they won't be able to have that sort of longevity and utilize their possessions here for whatever goal they may have. And so that's definitely a key priority for the Ukrainians. And that's why we're not really going to be looking at the central axis, because there's not much to look at. I guess you could say in terms of geolocated footage, we have this footage here from the 11th of August of heavy Russian shelling of the forested area south of Olgovka, which confirms to us the line of demarcation that I have previously set. So my mapping is pretty much in line with the footage. And then looking a bit eastwards, I'm trying to see if there's some other pieces of video footage that are interesting. Here you actually have also some of the columns from the air assault units. This time they were targeted by Tornado MLRS cluster munitions. And so that cluster strike, it targeted a column of 5 Ukrainian vehicles just to the northwest of Kruglenkoy. It's very hard to tell with these cluster munitions, all the submunitions dispersing. It's very difficult to tell if that actually yields a substantial amount of damage or even direct hits. And this video itself is also very difficult to discern anything within in terms of actual damage. But at the very least, we know that the Russians are very active here, both with their ground-launched artillery, but also with airstrikes. About 50% of Russia's entire sort of FAB capacity is now going towards striking the Sumy sort of rear and then also the Kursk offensive. And so that's a massive diversion away from other parts of the front line where they were previously active. And you could also see that it confirms to us that the Ukrainians are generally located in this region, which could have some sort of implication for the fields nearby. And also the goal of the Ukrainians here would be to sort of improve on the western flank of Malaya Loknaya, in an effort to prevent the Russians from retaking one of Ukraine's main nodes guarding the perimeter of their offensive at the moment. And just going a bit to the east, we have this video from Cherkasskoye, Porechnoy, and it shows Russian Lancets destroying 1 tank and 3 armored fighting vehicles. I think that's the wrong one, actually. The one that's actually from today is located here. 1 armored vehicle was destroyed. This is a Ukrainian one. It was spotted along the same road that I talked about from that video from August 9th over here. And this is now evident to us that the Ukrainians have a strong presence in this area with a lot of vehicles that are going through the road bisecting the village. And so it's turned into a sort of forward node. and organization points, but that means that they're also susceptible to Lancets. And that's become a big vulnerability for the Ukrainians, the fact that they don't have a way to counter the Orlan 10, Orlan 30 reconnaissance drones that then fix positions and artillery, and then also give Lancets the coordinates for these various targets, especially armored vehicles. It could be done on a small scale, sort of targeting some of these drones. But when you scale it out, the only really way to make a substantial difference would be through jamming. And we saw the Ukrainians undergo a massive sort of jamming operation over the first few days. Even then, it wasn't enough to repel all the Lancet attacks. And now we're seeing that it hasn't been enough to change the volume of those attacks and the damage incurred to the Ukrainians. And so clearly, it has not been enough. And so that's one of the big liabilities the Ukrainians face as they try to advance through the open and then also solidify control of those same regions. Looking a bit to the east, Martinovka, this is one of the areas where the fighting has become concentrated in. We're not seeing as much of a broad front when we're looking at fighting. It's really been relegated to specific parts of the line, and that includes this village here. Because what's being said by Russian sources is that on August 9th, that's when the Ukrainians got control over the entirety of Martinovka. Then you add the counterattack conducted by some elements of the 488th Regiment, and then perhaps some of the reinforcements that came in from the Donetsk grouping, volunteers, and also some Akhmat forces, and they were involved in the pushing in back towards Martinovka and retaking it. Those are claims that were made by Russian sources, but Ukrainian sources did mention similar attacks, but claimed that they were repelled. Then on 11th, what was mentioned is that the Russian forces actually had a presence in southern Martinovka, but that's actually the northern portion was still under some sort of Ukrainian control. And the Ukrainians were also able to launch a counterattack towards Kruglik and retake it after the Russians had pushed them out around August 10th. And so then if we're taking those reports coming from some pro-Ukrainian sources at face value, then it would imply that the front line looks something like this. But I can't visually confirm any sort of presence of Ukrainians in Kruglik anymore. What I do know is that this video was filmed by Russian sources showing that there were 4 Russian soldiers in Martinovka, and that is from very recent, from the 11th of August, and you could see that it's located in the southern portion. Martinovka itself is a very important village because, again, it acts as a sort of conduit between the rest of Kursk Oblast and Sudzha itself. And so it's really important for the Ukrainians to maintain control of this region so they could actually have access to the road, and then for the Russians so they could have access to the rest of the Russian garrison that is currently defending in eastern Sudzha. And so in a way now it's become a sort of compromise where the Russians do have a way to connect with the eastern grouping and the Ukrainians also still have a means by which to utilize the highway. But this is not sustainable. There's going to be very heavy fighting to gain control over the entirety of the village. If we're assessing the situation elevation-wise, then you could say there's a ridge that runs sort of along the R200, and that's under Ukrainian control. But again, this is so close to the front line that I'm not sure whether it has some sort of immediate impact on the rear because, again, it's such an exposed area. You don't want to be seen outside over there along the highway unless you're advancing with a vehicle. Then a bit eastwards was another sort of elevated region, and this one is sort of from Kruglik and extends southwards. And this is an area that already is a bit further to the east. It's an area the Russians are using as a connecting point between Sudzha and the rest of Kursk Oblast. And it is really important that the Russians are in control of it because it means that they're able to overlook much of the fighting, not necessarily in Martinovka because the Ukrainians do still control some of the heights that actually extend further east from the highway and are located in northern Martinovka. But what the heights in this X really do is give the Russians some sort of cover that are located in this very, very low elevated valley over here in Mirny and in the rest of eastern Sudzha. And so that is important. The Russians are still in control of that region. It is important that they could still have some sort of road access to the sort of eastern flank, but it is a very tenuous sort of road connection. There aren't many paved roads here, although the width of the connection is rather large. So that is a sort of silver lining for the Russians. Looking deeper into the fighting here, there are some murmurs actually from Ukrainian side that the Ukrainians have been able to cross over the river again and have been able to reassert control over Makhnovka, but nothing has been confirmed as of now. So we're keeping the front line the same. What we do know is that, first of all, the Ukrainians are present in Guevo. We do have a video from August 11th of a Ukrainian squad walking through Guevo and raising a flag. It's probably a few days early, But we do now know that there are some sort of Ukrainian DRG efforts that have been able to infiltrate past the Psel River that you see over here and capture the village of Plechovo. This has been verified by both sides at this point, and there are already local reports coming in from Russian sources of some sort of infiltration by the Ukrainians and maybe Georgian Legion and maybe from the RDK actually, or maybe from the AFU itself. Combination probably is the truth. And they have been able to operate near Borky and Spalnoy, but these are rather small forces. It's not anything massive. They're small squads, sometimes with a few vehicles. And even in Ozerki, there's been some mentions. In Ozerki, if we're measuring it out, that's about, let's see, 14 kilometers away from the current front line, and it's about, if we're measuring it out, 8 kilometers away from the border. The issue is we can't say for absolute certainty that these are actually Ukrainian forces operating here. It could just be that residents were hearing nearby firefights near the border or near Plechovo, and then they sort of extrapolated that to say that there was fighting within the village, or it's the sound of Russian soldiers shooting down drones. And so then you could very quickly see how with singular snippets, that's a sort of anecdote, it becomes hearsay and then becomes, in the minds of a lot of people online, a massive breakthrough. And so you've got to stay very cautious when looking at that, because I know 24 hours ago, there were a lot of sort of reports coming out of this sort of massive Ukrainian breakthrough towards Belitsa. And it was largely coming from some sort of smaller Russian channels. And then, of course, the Ukrainians are going to amplify that. And no, none of that is actually the case as of now. Of course, there could still be some sort of DRG infiltration operations here. And maybe the Ukrainians do try to take advantage of the lack of Russian reinforcements in this area, but nothing has actually unfolded at that extent so far. Additionally, you have Russian officials saying that there has been no recorded fighting in the Belovsky or the Obyansky districts, which are the ones that are located just east of where the current Ukrainian offensive is located. So I think Belovsky is around here, and then Obyansky is a bit further east around here. And yeah, definitely just keep an eye out for the movements here. DRGs, their goal is to create preparations for future offensives, but it's also to divert Russian forces away from certain areas to create the illusion that there may be an offensive in order to prevent the Russians from going and defending in one certain area with their maximum wherewithal. So that's all important. And speaking of that subject, if we're going to go a bit south, then there was actually an attempted Ukrainian raid across the border that was foiled by the Russians, and it was near this village over here. So you could see that the Russians, they talk about destroying 2 BTRs. The video shows 1 BTR being destroyed by drones, and this was before across the border. So these Ukrainian mobile units, they tried to advance along the highway and then actually cross into a village and raise one of their flags like they did in nearby parts of the Belgorod region. It's not a serious attempt to get control over these regions, at least not yet, but it does create that sort of psychological and diversion effect. And so before the Ukrainians could even do that, the Russians spotted them because they saw their sappers working at night, and then they destroyed the vehicles. And so the issue with this region that, of course, the Russians have to keep an eye out for is that Graivoron is pretty close, and this is a really important node for a large grouping of Russian forces. And you could see that it is in a sort of compromised position just in terms of the sort of salient that is formed by the border between Russia and Ukraine. So far, we haven't had any concrete information about a large Ukrainian buildup here. But of course, you're going to see information circulating surrounding that because of the way that the position is compromised. And then also because the Ukrainians do have an interest in trying to basically end any sort of Russian efforts of advancing over here deeper into Liptsy during their sort of Kharkiv offensive campaign. But so far, in terms of actual troop movements and offensives, nothing can be verified from that region. What we are going to look into now is actually the Russian troop structure, which I do find to be pretty interesting. And so what we know for sure is that there are various elements from volunteer units that are from Donetsk that were largely on the rear. We have already talked about some of them previously, and they've been filmed as well in Kursk and in Rilsk, Lgov, etc. You as well have Ahmad forces. We've gotten into some of the regiments like Sever or Zapad. But clearly, according to Russia's estimations, this is not enough to fully repel these attacks and fully take advantage of the Ukrainians being out in the open like this. And so it's being mentioned by some Russian sources about troop movements, and this cannot be verified yet, only 2 units from this list I have been able to verify myself are actually operating here. But what's being mentioned is that in Kherson, 2 paratrooper battalions were moved away to actually go to this region into Kursk and be involved in defensive activities. In Zaporozhye, the 38th and 64th Motor Rifle Brigades were mentioned. In Kupiansk, it was reported that several motor rifle battalions were moved away from the front line to get involved in defense. Then in Kharkiv, this is what's the most believable to me. They're saying that in this northern group of forces that is currently involved in the Volchansk operation, that you had the 1009th Motor Rifle Regiment, the 79th Motor Rifle Regiment, 272nd Motor Rifle Regiment, and the 138th Motor Rifle Brigade. All of them moved away from the front line here, and then a couple dozen kilometers to the northwest get involved with defending. And this is what we're seeing now in terms of outside sources. I've seen actual casualty reports from the 272nd Regiment, so I have moved them to confirm they're actually located here. And the casualty reports from Facebook, I think they did mention explicitly that the men actually died within this region here, Kursk. And then the other unit that I've been able to verify is that 810th Motor or Naval Infantry Brigade. And it's a unit that was previously stationed around Kherson, probably the strongest unit that the Russians had in that area. And then it was moved recently to Pokrovsk, probably to strengthen their reserve or rear forces over there, and then eventually get rotated in after some rest. But now, due to these developments, they've been joined by the various sort of DPR or volunteer units, ex-Wagners, that are now being moved to defend over here. So now the 810th has also been sent to be involved in some of the localized counterattacks. I think they have been involved already in engagements around Martinovka. Now, regarding the movement from Kharkiv to Kursk, some Russian sources say that at least 2,000 men have been moved, which seems it could be on the lower end, given some of the units that were mentioned in the unconfirmed reports. But if those reports turn out to be false, then it does turn into something more understandable. They also mention artillery pieces, mortars, UAVs, sappers, and tank platoons being moved away from the Volchansk offensive to be involved here. That is something that is very likely. And that's one of the immediate effects that we'll see. The Russians will no longer be able to continue with offensive activities in Volchansk because so many resources will be diverted away to deal with the nearby threats. Then from Belgorod, from the Belgorod region itself, from the Graveron region that I just talked about, at least one company of a motor rifle brigade has been moved away from its station in Graveron to actually defend in the region to the northwest. And then there's one motor rifle regiment that was operating near the Ukrainian village and conducting some sort of DRG efforts into this village, Sutnitsky Kazachok. And that maybe is the 245th Regiment. I'm not sure. But based on all this information that we have, if we were to sort of go out and extrapolate, add up all the numbers, then the unconfirmed reports of troop movements would show that there's probably in the ballpark of 25,000 Russian forces being moved to this region. Now, this may not be true because not all of those units are potentially moving here, or maybe certain elements are just moving here. And so based on the available information about the 2 units that I mentioned, then it's probably in the ballpark of around 6,000 Russian troops that are moving here. But that's only including the 272nd and 810th brigades, not including the fact that you have Akhmats and various other volunteer units from the Donetsk region that have also been moved in recently. And so that bumps it up several thousand, probably above 10,000 at that point. Now, moving to the Luhansk front, if we're going to zoom in for you guys, you'll see there's now a video that confirms a lot of the information I talked about in yesterday's upload. So here you can see it's a video from the 72nd Air Assault Brigade, one of the main units defending here for the Ukrainians. The FPV strike a series of Russian squads that were advancing through open fields, but also near tree lines, and they were involved in the offensive activities we discussed to try to shape the battlefield in a way that would force the Ukrainians out of Stelmakivka. And this is a confirmation that the Russians are actually embarking upon this, although, of course, there is a Ukrainian drone response. What we're seeing is that the Russian forces are securing really important elevation that is west of Tabaivka, that is going to help the Russians overlook the Ukrainian positions in these trench regions and put them on equal footing with the rest of the Ukrainian defenders that are located on this rather large hill. And the capture of this hill, which is just completely consisting of some trenches, but mainly just fields, that would give the Russians really important positions that overlook the highway leading to Kupiansk and many of the villages near the Oskil River that are on the road to Kupiansk itself. So that's a goal that the Russians are looking at for their broader goal of taking back that city. But then looking a bit southwards, in Berestove, the Russian forces have been able to advance through a certain ridge that located within this red square. And then a bit southwards, they've been able to solidify control over really important heights that are just to the east of Samakivka. And more generally, a lot of these fields that the Russians are advancing through that are west of this highway, they are located on a ridge that is directly overlooking the valley on which Samakivka is on. And at this point, although there is a very strong Ukrainian garrison in the village, it is being attacked very, very fiercely from the east and now from the north. And there are various ravines and paths that lead into the village directly. And so it's going to become more and more difficult to supply it. And attrition rates are going to rise here. And so the Russians really are trying to squeeze them out. And then there would be a domino effect of Myazor Sharifka falling, as well as Andriivka. And you could see the general Ukrainian plan in the region just to create the conditions for those dominoes to fall by taking out the most important node and then trying to solidify control over nearby regions until you reach the next line of defense. Now, moving on to Vodiane, we're going to zoom in and see that there has been a confirmed advance. Let's look at the extent. It's about 1.7 square kilometers. It's a Russian advance that is through some of these open fields and also along a road that connects to the 0532 highway. Here, it's an advance amounting to 1.9 kilometers. And what we see in this video is it's the Bulava drone unit of the 72nd Brigade. Their drones drop grenades onto Russian infantry near the highway. So you could see strikes near a vehicle. You could see it near several squads that are operating around these tree lines. Again, a very similar story to a lot of the videos we see from here, but it is enough of a confirmation to prove to us that the Russians are inching very close to infiltrating the highway along another route. And here it's important because the Ukrainians are defending this position with a very notable trench, and the Russians are just at its outskirts, so they are preparing to storm it. And this is all a part of Russia's preparation to fully clear out the eastern bank of the highway, and then from there have the necessary positions to push towards Vodiane itself. And so that's all I have for today. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.